Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning into a brand new After Dinner mini-series titled Behind the Code. On the show, we welcome Art Blocks artists to share a deeper look into their project's creative coding and process. Today, we welcome Ben Snell, who joins us to speak about his project, Cattleya. At the end of the show, we'll open the floor to questions that have been asked on the live YouTube page or Discord. Welcome, Ben. I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you for having me. Hello, hello, hello. My name is Ben Snell. I am an artist who works with code. A lot of my work is physical in nature, and this series, Cattleya, is different in the sense that it is entirely digital, but it still continues to explore themes that are common in my work, like nature and nurture, the tension between form and function, the beingness and coming to beingness of objects, and all those sorts of things, creation and automation. This project explores generative orchids and the sort of magic and mystery behind them. They are these like incredible creatures. I have one here that is currently flowering. You might be able to see it in my video. It's called Neophineta, and the variety is called Sekai. You can see little flowers at the top. This orchid is sterile, which means that it's been passed down for hundreds of years, and every descendant is sort of like a cutting of the original that was collected in Japan. But what's so fascinating about these, and this orchid and any in particular, is that they've all evolved to have these very close, tight-knit relationships with pollinators. And the shape of each one, the color, the scents, the smells, they're all different and they're all unique. And that's one of the things that really I became enamored with about orchids. So today, what I'm going to be doing is I'm giving a brief overview of the project and then diving into a couple elements that I find really interesting technically. I'll be diving into code, showing some demos, sharing links to those demos, sharing some process work that I've done over the last year, and finally opening it up to questions. I want to allow enough time for anyone to ask about diving into certain elements of this project, because it's very dense and it has a lot of components, a lot of compounding generative systems. So without further ado, I'll dive into a little bit about my process in making Cattleya. A note on the name, I I thought for the longest time that this kind of orchid, Cattleya, was called Cattleya, and so I've been calling the project Cattleya, but in fact it's supposed to be pronounced Cattleya. So whatever you prefer, that's fine with me. I may continue to say Cattleya because I like the ring to it, but over the course of making Cattleya or Cattleya, I took screenshots of the outputs over the course of the 8 months that I had worked on it, and I took about 5,000, screenshots, and I compiled them into this 1 minute clip. And I'm going to play it and sort of like briefly walk through the different parts of my process. At the very beginning, I sort of spent a lot of time playing with the rendering pipeline and getting the sort of depth of field blur effect. And that was one of the first things that I had in place, which is interesting because I feel like sometimes people start with a subject and then move to the rendering into the style. But here I started with the style into the sort of like flow field effect and then worked on the subject matter, which I knew was orchids, but would be a large undertaking. So I sort of saved that for last. I started with exploring flower shapes, then I explored foliage shapes. And then you can see here, eventually, both flower and foliage shapes came together. And what was so interesting about this model, I'll show you another clip, is that every Cattleya is, hold on, let me see it. Where is it? There we go. Every Cattleya is fully parametric, meaning if you were to sort of like peek under the hood and watch one Cattleya being rendered, you would see it growing, which is really interesting. And I designed the model to be parametric because I wanted to create forms that could be seen, visualized, especially flowers, at any moment in their growth and their maturity. You'll note if you look at some of the flowers in those that were generated on art blocks, every now and then you'll see a little bud that hasn't quite opened yet. And they're relatively uncommon because I wanted to prioritize having flowers that were fully opened. But for example, in this one right here, number 61, you can see most of the flowers are fully open. And then up here, sort of top center right, you have some buds that haven't opened yet. On the left here, you also have some buds that haven't opened yet. So those kind of like small little Easter egg-ish kinds of things were really important to me. I wouldn't really call them Easter eggs, but having things in captured a moment in time, a moment in their life cycle, and not complete full maturity, but like somewhere close to that, was an important sort of like storytelling point in communicating the sort of liveliness of these forms. But back to the time lapse, started playing with combining both the flowers and the foliage, and then started placing each of the plants in a plant set in a very kind of particular order. And you can see here I started playing with the organization of plants in a plant set. Eventually I started playing with spikes. So here was a lengthy spike study, trying to fine tune the way in which spikes grew. Spikes are the things that actually hold the flowers. And then for a long time, I focused on composition. There are three different compositions: forest, macro, and still life. And you can see we're not even halfway through. By this point, I sort of had a finalized form and then began focusing in on the bugs and the bugs between different browsers and rendering pipelines. And that was a complete mess, as anyone who's worked with this kind of medium knows before. But yeah, for a large portion of this project, it was a lot of fine tuning. You know, they say like, what is it, 80-20, where 80% of the time you spend fine tuning a project and then 20% of the time you actually spend writing it. So that's definitely reflects the sort of core of this project. But the structure of the code itself was sort of, I would say, broken into three parts largely. And these were the sort of different parts that I tackled in this process: shape, color and texture, and then composition and rendering. So I sort of started with the composition and rendering first. I, played around with compositions, different ways of rendering. And then I started really honing in on flower shape and foliage shape, as well as colors and patterns. And so I can dive deep into any of these a little bit more later on. But I am going to dive into one component, which is flower shape. So for me, shape is one of the more interesting parts of Cattleya because it utilizes this new approach to modeling that I hadn't used very much before and find really interesting. So I'm going to share my iPad screen to sort of give an overview of what I'm talking about here. So just to start, I just want to review a couple things with everyone. So if you're not already familiar with the anatomy of an orchid, because I'm going to use anatomical terms, and some of these are very common, when I talk about the foliage, I really talk about the plant itself. And the plant is composed of leaves and roots. Now, Cattleya doesn't visualize the roots. Maybe that's something I do in a future iteration, but I don't do that here because the plants are largely in pots or the bases of them aren't very visual. Most orchids also have something called a pseudobulb. And a pseudobulb is a storage organ that exists sort of like in the stalk of the plant, sort of like around this area. And it doesn't always live in that area or look like this particular kind of foliage, but it's used to store nutrients in water. People may be surprised to know that orchids are very hardy, but they are, and I think the pseudobulb is in part a reason for that. Another part of the anatomy is the spike. The spike is the sort of lengthy stem that holds the flowers. And then, of course, the last component is the flower itself. So these are the different components of an orchid. Today, we're going to be focusing mostly on the flower shape. So here's an example of an orchid flower. Orchids have a sort of bilateral symmetry that's common amongst all flowers within this kind of plant. And interestingly, they sort of have a couple different sets of leaves, or petals rather, petals and sepals. These here, the ones in the back, the ones that are sort of this more salmony color, are called sepals. And the other ones that are sort of more of this hot pink are called petals. And there's 2 lateral petals and 2 lateral sepals. So you can see, let's see, this and this, both of these are the lateral sepals. This is sort of like the lone top sepal. I think it has a more common scientific name, but I don't remember it. These are the lateral petals. And then last but not least is this incredibly showy lip, which is it's not the dorsal, it's the something petal. But that's sort of the basic structure of flowers. And every flower that you find in an orchid is going to have some similar structure as that. So when I started this project, when I started wanting to model flower shapes, I first did some research into what kinds of shapes flowers represent, or what kinds of shapes they come in. And I began accumulating a collection of flowers. And there were about maybe 6 or 8 blooming at the time that I was trying to model the flower shapes. And so I started taking measurements of them. So the first sort of part of this process, and this process is called statistical shape modeling. Statistical shape modeling. And modeling, can't even spell. So that's what I'm going to be reviewing right now. And it's a really interesting process because it allows you to take shapes from nature, from the world that you've collected, and model them in a statistically significant way in which you can synthesize new shapes. That's ultimately what I wanted to do here when it came to flower shape. I wanted to study orchids in the wild, in nature, understand how their shapes were related, the shapes being the angles, the sizes of the petals and sepals and their relationship to each other, and then be able to synthesize new forms from that distribution. So the first step in this process was taking measurements from real orchids, and I ended up collecting, it was an incredibly large data set, but it was large enough to begin making inferences about this population. Let me see if I can find that. So here, this is one of there are 2 repos that I work in. This one does the statistical shape modeling and outputs the sort of decomposed features. But this NumPy array right here is the flower shape data. And each one of these columns represents a different measurement of flower shape. So for example, if we look at some of my measurements, I think we'll look right here. Okay. So I geometrically modeled the individual petals and then took measurements of different things, like, for example, the width, the length of the petals, alpha and beta, which described their angles from the side. So let's see if I can find an example here. Each petal sort of has a different angle with respect to the flower's vertical axis. And so alpha and beta describe both of those. And then there were a couple other parameters that describe the curvature of the leaves and the ratio of them. Because as you can imagine, flowers come in, I meant petals, not flowers. They come in all different shapes and sizes. And so, for example, if we're just looking at the dorsal sepals, the dorsal petals in green right here, the shapes, the lengths, the curvatures are all different. And so these were all things that I collected measurements of. After you collect those measurements and accumulate a data set, or after I did that, the next thing I did was to apply PCA, a principal component analysis, and reduce the dimensionality of the data set. After which I dropped off the components that contributed least to reconstructing the data. And what you end up with are, for each of the samples that you have, for example, here we have 3 different samples. We have a pink flower, the blue flower, and the orange flower, all with different measurements. You get this latent space in which each of those samples is represented by a coordinate. So for example, maybe the orange is represented by 1, -1. The pink is represented by 0.5, 0.5, and so on and so forth. What's so interesting about this space is the closer 2 points are within the space, the more similar their samples are represented, or the more similarly represented are their samples. So what I mean by that is, if you have 2 samples, for example, one here and one here that are really close, these 2 are going to be a lot more similar than, say, one here and one here, if that makes sense. So this latent space is embedded into Cattleya, both for flower shape and foliage shape. And I'll show you exactly where that happens in a moment, but what's so useful about embedding the space and this statistical model is that you can peek into the latent space and synthesize new flower forms, or any kind of shape for that matter, anything you're modeling. So for example, if I wanted to pick this point right here and then sort of extrapolate its shape, I could come up with a completely new flower shape that's still statistically significant within this distribution. So that's what's so interesting about the statistical shape model. If we take a look at the code, you'll notice that, let's see if I can find it. So the way I have my code organized is primarily into these classes and a number of different files, which are all pulled together when I render. But here you'll see there's a file called SSM, which represents the statistical shape model. And the statistical shape model, it's very simple. In fact, it really just, when you want to generate new forms, you just generate a random coordinate along Gaussian distribution in the space. And then you perform a pretty simple matrix multiplication, which results in the reconstructed features. Now, it's not completely lossless. It is lossy and has some sort of degradation of the data inherent to this process. But instead of, picking one flower from a set of 12 that I modeled, I can take the small quantity that I modeled. I think it was only 6. I measured 6 flowers and used them as a sort of jumping off point for extrapolating and interpolating what a new flower could look like. And so the parameters that are output from that statistical shape model that represent the model itself are up here. You can see there's the components of the model. We have I don't remember what C is, but we have the mean, the standard deviation, translations. I should remember what those were. But in any case, it's a very compact representation of shapes, and very efficient when it comes to doing things in the browser that need to be done with limited access to computation and storage. So this was one of the sort of appealing factors of using statistical shape models. And it's really interesting also just from the perspective of trying to understand flower shapes. So let me share with you a demo that I made, which is available to anyone with an internet connection. Okay, so if you go to demos.bensnell.cattleya/flower-shape. Also accessible if you go to my website, click on Cattleya, and you scroll to the very bottom. You'll notice there are a couple demos at the bottom, and I'll be looking at a couple of these. But if you click on flower shape, you'll be able to follow along. So this is a demo of flower shape. It is basically the shape model that is used to generate the variety of flower shapes within Cattleya. The sliders on the left are critical. Each one represents one of the axes in the latent space. So I found that in order to represent about 95% of the variation in flower shapes that I had collected, I needed 4 dimensions in the latent space. And so each of these sliders represents traversing along one of those dimensions. And so we can see they're all in the middle right now, which means what we're looking at is the average flower shape. Because when you generate a statistical shape model and you sample at the origin, you are able to sort of like look into and peek into the most average or the most common shape. What gets interesting is when you start traversing along the axes. So the first axis comprises the most variation, and then progressively they comprise less and less variation. So here you'll notice, as actually I'm going to refresh this page so you can see the bottom. And you get a different color each time. I'm just going to try to find one that's sort of easy to see through the stream. I think this one's pretty good. As you traverse along the first axis, you notice that the shape of the flower changes. Everything about the flower shape changes. I haven't explicitly told the algorithm how to change flower shape. Rather, I've collected data, modeled the data, and reduced its dimensionality into a very compact form, and am now traversing that low dimensional representation to synthesize new ones. So in some ways, it's sort of like a kind of unstructured learning. But what's so interesting is the first component that you traverse along captures the most variation, which means this is the variation that we're seeing now encompasses sort of like the greatest swath in which orchid flowers vary. And all of these are completely feasible forms. This one that you see here is uncommon, but is one of the orchids in my collection. Unfortunately, it's not blooming now, so I can't show you, but it's actually called Sorcerer's Apprentice. People to find, yeah. So it sort of looks like this. It has a very crazy shape, but it's also super interesting evolutionarily because it has like an umbrella and also these long sort of like ponytails off the side that wick away water. So no water enters the sort of cavity, the cup that you see in the lip, the petal, the lip petal. These are pollinated by little bugs that land in the cup accidentally. And then the only way to escape is by crawling up the back and rubbing against the pollen and the reproductive organs of the plant. So if it filled with water, like some carnivorous plants do, it would drown the bug, and then it would have no chance of reproducing because it wouldn't be able to climb out and rub against the pollen and the other reproductive organs. So shape is a really important part of this for me because it encapsulates the sort of like innate machine evolutionary intelligence that exists within each of these forms, each of these plants. So if we take a look back at the demo, you'll note shape changing along the first one. I'm going to set it back in the middle. The second axis changes shape in a different way. And so we can see, whereas the first one sort of like, I don't know, if I were imagining like naming these or the emotions that are associated with them, on this side we have something that's sort of like very imposing, and then on the other side we have something that's a little more welcoming in terms of shape and stature and pose. And along the second axis, we can see that the sort of the narrowness of each of the petals and sepals is one of the primary features that changes. The third axis is sort of like how curled in the flower is. And surprisingly, some of them actually curl in completely and barely allow insects and bugs and pollinators to come in. You would think most are just like, hey, I'm here, come pollinate me. But in fact, even though I didn't model a flower that looked exactly like this, it still is possible within the space, which is sort of a coincidence, but a happy one, that it is a possible and common flower shape. In the last axis, we see there's sort of another point of variation. All of these can be combined infinitely. So, if we were to generate a random one, you can just like randomly move the sliders in any which way, you would have a new flower. Each of the flowers that was generated in Cattleya is a completely different shape. And we can see some of the different shapes here. There might be And like some of them sort of look similar. I can see how these two might be construed to be pretty similar, but it's just sort of a coincidence that they look similar. And if we take a look under the hood at those components, at that coordinate and latent space, they're still very different. So that's this sort of process of generating shapes, super interesting to me and has proven to be a really valuable tool. And if we take a look at the code itself, the code is sort of broken into, if we take a look at the setup and draw functions, I'll run them through them just for a moment. We have general initialization. There was a bug with the canvas being vertically flipped, so I unflip it here. And then here is where the shapes are all built, creating this composition. So new CP. CP is the composition class, which comprises a plant set, which comprises multiple plants, each of which comprises of many leaves, pseudobulbs, spikes, and plenty of flowers. Each flower consists of plenty of petals, and the stigmatic column, which holds its pollen. Once the composition is generated, then I render maps using the sort of rendering pipeline that may or may not be able to talk about because we're running out of time. I collect the marks from that pipeline, and then after initializing the primary canvas with a gradient and preparing the blur shaders that I have, I begin iterating through all the marks that have been collected and draw them progressively, which is what you see when you render one of these. For example, if I render this one, you'll see the composition being generated right now, the maps being drawn, and then finally all the marks being collected and drawn one by one over the course of about 10 seconds. So that's sort of like the general structure of the code. And if we take a peek into composition, you'll find there are tons of compositional parameters. There's so much that goes on inside of this. You'll note if you look on art blocks and you scroll down to the features for a given token, there are lots of features. I think there are like maybe 40 features. These features don't always sort of like, for example, there's one called flower shape stature. Flower shape stature, for example, is the first principal component. The second one is flower shape mood. The third one is flower shape approach. The fourth one is flower shape resolve. Each one of these I tried to correlate the dimension, the axis in the latent space with a kind of attribute. And so the first one sort of felt like stature to me. And so on one side, you might have, let's see if I can find all of the features here. Oh, so many things open. On one side, you might have like a sympathetic, and then on the other side, you might have an imposing shape. And so that's what correlates this. These sliders right here correlate with those features within, but there are plenty more and lots that I didn't reveal in features. But yeah, that's sort of general gist of how I generated these shapes, these widely varying shapes. Might take a peek under the hood and take a look at a plant set. I mean, there's so much here and it's not super readable because some of these variables are only single letter, but composition consists of, like I said before, a plant set, which at runtime finds the ideal placement of plants next to each other. Because when you have an orchid, let me see if I can find a good example here. So this here is, I don't know if you can see my screen, this is on Cydium Eye Candy Pinky, I believe. And you'll note it has these sort of pseudobulbs toward the bottom. And pseudobulbs have sort of like an angularity to them such that when new pseudobulbs emerge, as you see a little baby emerging right here on the side, they sort of align with each other. So, if you were growing a plant that was perfectly, that had like a perfect cylindrical column to its trunk, it wouldn't have to like rotate when a new plant was generated. But here, when a new plant emerges from sort of like the parent stock, it sort of is pushed into place to sort of fall in line with others. So that happens within the composition in the plant set. There's a plant set generator, which generates plant sets. There is a plant generator, which generates plants given a set of parameters. And then, of course, there's the plant. And the plant itself consists of leaves, a bulb, and somewhere far enough along, you'll find spikes here. And there is a spike. Here's the spike class. And you can tell this is very object-oriented. This is just how my mind works. There's, I think, another spike generator somewhere. And then, of course, on the spikes, you have the flowers. And you'll note in here that when you create a flower, it's passed a set of parameters, the axis of the flower, and then a palette describing its colors and textures and the resolution of the flower. And all of those parameters that are resultant from sort of like peeking into this latent space are passed right here in parameters. And I might be able to find exactly where that happens. So within the spike, when all the flowers are being generated, it passes a variable called FP. FP is set in the plant generator as a new SSM object using the spike or the shape, the flower shape parameters. And so that's sort of where the magic of flower shape happens. And you'll note within petal, it's passed a bunch of parameters, and these are some of the ones that I took measurements of in the very beginning. The length of a petal, the width of a petal, the ratio alpha, which is a measurement of curvature, beta, also a measurement of curvature, lambda, a measurement of curvature in a different direction, and theta, which I forget. But all of those are then used to build the petals individually. So I think I'm about time now. I'm going to stop reviewing flower shape and open up to questions at this point, because I don't want to just continue talking about stuff just for the sake of it. But if there are any things that people are curious about or to see more about or learn more about, please speak up now or put your questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer them. So does anyone have questions?
Ben, I thought that was amazing. I was saying in the chat that I was learning so much about flowers that my mother would be very proud. And so that kind of leads me to my first question is, when did your passion and deep learning of flowers, particularly these orchids, begin?
My passion in flowers. I became obsessed with them over the pandemic. If anyone's curious, I wrote a Medium article which describes everything that I've described today. So before living in Asheville, North Carolina, I lived in New York, and I lived there for a number of years. My safe space was this little bubble I built full of plants, and my collection of orchids and bonsai grew. And this is where my obsession began. I collected them because they were beautiful, and then very quickly discovered that, yes, the shapes, the colors, the smells, they're beautiful, they're entrancing, but there's something that lies underneath the surface, something that's carnal, primal, something that is much older than us. Many of these plants exist in concert and sort of like go about their dance, their life in concert with another organism that pollinates it. And these beautiful dances that have sort of unfolded over thousands, probably millions of years, are embodied in their shapes. And their shapes tell stories. And so their shapes, their colors, their patterns. That's where my obsession began, I would say, from this lonely little bubble in a small New York studio looking at a brick wall.
So you've achieved such an organic feel to Cattleya, which I guess I find incredibly impressive because you're essentially recreating a living organism. And so you spend a considerable amount of time refining the code. But my question is, how do you know when to stop refining and to push it?
That's a great question. I've made mistakes in the past where I have spent too long trying to understand um, a biological system and actually ended up sort of falling out of love with it. So I was very careful this time around to not try and force something. Instead, I wanted to make something that was just for myself and just for me. And fortunately, it's something that I was able to share with the world through art blocks. But in the beginning and for the first like 6 months or so, it really was just for me. I was making it for myself. And you asked like, when do you stop? Um, I I stopped when I felt like I was being surprised by the algorithm, and when I felt like I captured maybe just the slightest sort of mystery that I feel like orchids embody. I'm undoubtedly one could spend their lifetime trying to model a single plant, let alone like a whole genus. I think orchids are a genus, and I when I started to be surprised and when I started to feel like it had a life of its own, I sort of took a back seat and became more of a shepherd, and sort of let it find its own way. And then I very pointedly stopped after like 6 or 7 or 8 months because I was just exhausted.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, it's a good question, and I don't know if I have a great answer for that. It's like the artist tales of this time. When is something finished?
right.
It's never really finished.
We have a question from Jonathan Magel. And so he said, would love to learn how to create generative art. What is the best place to start on this path? So I don't know if you have any advice you can offer someone who's wants to begin their journey.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think everyone's starting place is a little bit different. I started playing with P5JS, and that's what this project is made with. Um, if you're like interested in starting out, I'd highly recommend, heading over to P5JS and playing around with it. I also like maybe other people work this way, maybe they don't, but I'm very project oriented, and so I decided I wanted to make generative orchids, and by God, I was going to find a way, like whether it meant working with P5JS or 3JS. And this project is a learning experience, as most projects are, and so I don't really exactly have like tutorials to recommend per se. Um, but I would recommend starting with something that you love and allowing yourself the opportunity to be surprised. I I let me see if I can find. So last year I started playing around with generative art after I had sort of like abandoned it for like 4 or 5 years, and these were some of the sketches. And I was just like, I just want to start sketching, just like for fun. I just want to do this for me. And I was walking along the beach one time and found a seashell, and it was amazing how this this life had like grown this beautiful shell, and like this shell was like an excretion of its life in a way. And so I sort of wanted to explore that a little, and so I started, inspired by Paul Valéry's Man of the Seashell, which I highly recommend. Um, I began exploring that intertwinedness of form and function. And these were some of the outputs of it. And, I haven't done anything with this. It's just like, it was just fun. And I just tried it for fun. And then I live near the Blue Ridge Mountains now. And I was like, maybe I can try modeling them. And so, in the same way that I sketch on my iPad or I sketch on physical paper, I just tried sketching that out here. And it didn't really lead anywhere, but, that's the way of things. And then I wanted to try something a little bit more abstract. And so these came about. Who knows where it's going? But it's not like you're not going to like, I guess, allow yourself the opportunity to be surprised. Someone told me that once, and it completely changed the way that I make and think about making. I don't really oftentimes set out with a goal, but I allow myself to be taken by um, the discoveries along answering a question. And so my recommendation would be find something you love that you're curious about, and um, and yeah, start making it and expressing yourself. And highly recommend P5JS.
That's amazing advice. That's the last question I have. Before we sign off, is there anything you wanted to close with, Ben?
Yeah, I'll just say that, if you are interested in learning more about this process of making Cattleya, you can head over to my Medium article linked on my website. Um, the Medium article runs through not just flower shape, but foliage shape, flower color, flower patterns, flow, can't even talk, foliage color, the composition, the rendering, the style, all of these different components and how they're pieced together. You can find the link to that Medium article at the top right here. Um, and I also, I've had a lot of fun playing around with the demo, and sometimes I just do that to relax. And I don't know, maybe y'all will find that fun too. So I appreciate everyone listening in and taking their time to learn a little more about this process. And I hope you learned something interesting. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
No, of course. And I'll be including the Medium article link in the description of the YouTube video, as well as the link to the demo if anybody wants to play around with that in the future. And I want to say thanks to everyone who watched live today, asked questions, and those will be watching in the future. Very special thanks to Ben for speaking on his project. And until next time, be great and happy minting.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.